Um, I'm going to share with you basically things that I believe in, and you're going to kind of learn about what I believe in this presentation tonight. I'm going to take you on a journey through time of the last 15,000 years here locally, and including like basically right where we're standing. And we'll talk about different aspects of that. I was told to come up with a catchy name, so we came up with from polar bears to no bears. When's the last time you saw a bear in Glencoe, right? Yeah, there used to be lots, but and so I'm sharing with you my belief in First Nations land care and how that affected the landscape, and then what's happened since the arrival of Europeans. Okay, and so it's kind of not a good news story. And at the end, I'm going to talk a little bit about what we can do and where the future lies in restoration and things like that. Okay, and I'm going to spend a little time covering a section on our rare Carolinian tree species, just to introduce you to some of them that you may not be familiar with. Okay, so there's a picture of a black bear. And that's not in Middlesex County or Cantor Lambton. That's actually up by Rainy River, a picture that I took. Okay, the history of our local forests and landscapes with a focus on Carolinian species and ecological restoration. So we're going to start back to the last ice age. And I like to say that in this image here, this is the development of the St. Clair River. And these two people are in Point Edward wondering if anybody's home over in Port Huron. Okay, so that would be like the development. So, but that's what this landscape looked like 15,000 years ago. We had about a mile of ice. Okay, so right here, there was a mile of ice and snow. No trees, no forests, no nothing. Okay. And so over time, as the climate warmed, that started retreating. The Great Ice Shield started retreating, moving back to the north. This is an image showing about 14,500 years ago and where the Great Lakes are going to be appearing from underneath that Great Ice Shield. Okay. And then in these two images, we're talking about the retreat now and at different times in history. Okay. So the one on my left, is that on your left too, Ross? The one that says 10,000 years ago. Okay, the gray one shows where the ice field was at that time, about 10,000 years ago. And then below that, you had tundra, and then boreal, and then mixed forest, and then deciduous forest. So 10,000 years ago, right here, we were in the boreal forest. And if you've been up to Cochrane or Nakina or someplace up north, you know what the boreal forest looks like, right? So we were in the boreal forest, and at one time we were in the tundra, and before that we were covered with the ice. So as time went on and the ice fields, ice sheets retreated to the north, we were all the different zones. Okay, here's an image of the Great Lakes about 6,000 years ago on the other side. So it is hypothetically possible. I have never found any evidence, but it's possible that when it was tundra and at the edge of the ice sheets, that polar bears may have traveled through this region. But polar bears are basically a saltwater, like to eat seals and things like that. But they will eat anything, including people and reindeer and whatever they can get their hands on. So, but it's possible that polar bears pass through this area. And then the picture on the other side of the bear, polar bear sleeping there, is boreal forest. Okay, so we went from boreal forest, and at that time there were these great creatures. It was the age of the great mammals. Okay, and so we had mastodons here, and mastodon is basically North America's elephant. It's kind of basically what it is, being more of a temperate species though than the African elephant, handling colder weather. The woolly mammoth was more of an Arctic tundra creature, whereas the mastodon was a more southern forest mammal. And of course, about 10, 12,000 years ago, probably during the Covis peoples period, the great mammals were wiped out from the world, really. This was going on around the world. There was a period of time when the great mammals were considered, I guess, a threat, or else they made a great dinner to have. But anyways, we lost those, and that had nothing to do with climate change. That basically had to do with the arrival of human beings around the world, the great mammals disappearing. And of course, this ties into Glencoe and a number of areas around southern Ontario. And Mary was talking about, where did the molar go? It's over there. Oh yeah. Was everybody on Zoom able to see that when you were showing it? So and then so can you see that up there? Okay. Can you see that? They'll be able to see that on the screen, right?
Yes,
yeah.
we can see it.
So yeah, this thing weighs 4 pounds, and this was found locally. And one of the members of the family that found it is actually watching on Zoom from Edmonton. So thanks for doing that. So yeah, this is the tie to the mastodon. And I find that if you start talking about mastodons at different museums and that, most of them do have some kind of a sample or story about somebody that dug up the bones of a mastodon. Okay. And this is a news article about the situation here in Glencoe, the mastodon connection at Glencoe. Yeah. So after the boreal forest, this right where we are now was mixed forest. So that's coniferous evergreens mixed with deciduous trees, which, if you went up to Algonquin Park, that's basically what that is, mixed forest. There's still oaks and maples up there. And so then that was probably about 6,000 to 7,000 years ago. Okay. Then as things continued to warm up, we finally became the deciduous forest region about 4,000 to 6,000 years ago. And then savannas also developed. Okay. So now we've just quickly gone through, well, over 10,000 years, and we've gone from a mile of ice and snow to savannas and deciduous forests. Okay. And there's a really lucky scenario here in North America compared to other places in the world, especially Europe. So I just want to make a comparison here to what was going on in Europe, because the latitude we're at here is about the same as the northern Mediterranean. It's the same as Barcelona, same as Rome. That usually surprises people to think that. Okay. And so when the ice fields came down in North America, they reached down to about the Kentucky border, southern Ohio, the Kentucky border. So Kentucky was tundra at that time. Okay. And then Georgia was probably boreal and mixed forest, and then down in Florida and all across Alabama at the Gulf would have been the deciduous forest. Okay. So, but in Europe, consider that, the Kentucky border is much further south than us. Okay. So those ice fields in Europe went right to the Mediterranean and the mountain range that curved along the Mediterranean. And in doing so, they obliterated everything. There was nothing left in Europe, plant or animal wise, with the last ice age. Whereas in North America, they got to the Kentucky border, and from Kentucky, like I just explained, all the way down to Florida, were all of the bioregions, all of the forest zones intact, still thriving and surviving. So when the glaciers retreated, we got all our zones back. When the glaciers retreated in Europe, there was nothing to come back. So the things that did come back had to have a pretty special dispersal mechanism, produced an abundance of seed. Most of it had to blow back into Europe over mountains and from different areas. And so as a result, we still have a very intact high biodiversity in North America, whereas Europe has a very low biodiversity. Okay. And if you talk to an arborist in Europe, even in Spain, where you can grow palm trees, right? At our latitude, Spain has about 25, 26 species of trees, native trees. Okay. We have about 70 species of native trees. If you go to Tennessee and North Carolina, it's 125 species of native trees. If you go to England, surprisingly, there's about 6 to 8 species of native trees in England. So they were really wiped out, and it hasn't really returned. But now, having said that, with globalization and exploration around the world, guess how many trees are growing in England now, species-wise? About 800. 800. Most of them were originally in, botanical gardens and arboretums and in private collections of the noble and the rich and that sort of thing. But they always escape, right? Everything escapes. And so England now is quite a diverse variety of native plants and trees compared to what it would have been without that sort of impact. And we're going to talk about that kind of impact here too. So we became the deciduous forest with a lot of savannas around 4,000 to 6,000 years ago. Okay. Then came the deep, dark woods. The deep, dark woods. This started happening around the 1600s and into 1800. Our forests got really dense, big trees with a lot of dark shade, and that was a change. Okay. Before the deep, dark woods, there was a managed open landscape. Okay. A managed open landscape. And we know this. And who was managing that open landscape? Right? Our First Nations people, the Native Americans, were managing that open landscape. They wanted an open landscape because it provided things for them that they needed in their daily lives. Okay. And it provided things like foods and medicines, these open habitats, these meadows and that. And it also provided for huge herbivores like bison and elk and things like that, which was a good food source. And they used every part of these animals, right? They used every part when they harvested an animal. Nothing went to waste. And so they maintained these open landscapes to benefit themselves. But it was really in harmony with nature, okay? Because they actually, like Mary said earlier before the introduction about we are nature too, and we're part of nature. They were such a part of nature. They benefited biodiversity. They supported life so well and did it for thousands of years. Okay. It was to their benefit too, but it was always a positive effect on nature, on things like that. So we know that there was these open managed landscapes. When you search into the diaries and notes and historical records from people like Samuel de Champlain, La Salle, who traveled up the Great Lakes, built his boat, the Griffin, somewhere below Niagara Falls or above Niagara Falls, and then sent it all the way into Lake Huron, where it got lost in a storm somewhere in Lake Huron. So we have notes and records. Also, Cadillac is another one. He had 2 journeys, and we're talking about the 1600s here. La Salle was like 1670. Cadillac was 1694. Champlain before that. And so they were still seeing the results of the land care of the First Nations peoples. Okay. And in their notes, they talk about things like vast meadows with allays of fruit and nut trees, with massive herds of stags and enormous beasts, and things like that. Had really interesting names to call things, but at that time. So they were talking about huge herds of bison and elk. They talked about the passenger pigeon. They talked about wild turkeys and other game birds, and that there was a lot of open meadow habitat with lots of flowers and all that. So we have that historical evidence from the late 1600s and early 1700s. And the Great Rewilding started in the 1600s. So it was just kind of getting going at that time. Okay. So Cadillac had two journeys into the Great Lakes region, one into the Mackinac area and one into the Detroit area. And so maintaining the open landscape was the job of the land care job of the First Nations people. Okay. Now the key word here, and it's something it took me a long time to get my head around. The key word is maintain. They maintained an open landscape. Okay. They didn't have to come in and cut down 6-foot diameter trees and open a landscape. They maintained it, and this was possible because they were here 9,000 years ago. They were here when it was tundra. And we have evidence of that. There's evidence in Lake Huron of a great wall, and it runs kind of like from Bayfield over to Lexington, Michigan, down in the bottom of the lake, because the lake wasn't that big at that time, that many years ago. So we have evidence. And on Walpole Island and other First Nations communities, they have all kinds of evidence that they've been here for 8,000 to 10,000 years. So they were here when it was a totally open landscape. And all they had to do was maintain what they wanted to be open. They didn't have to clear any woods. They just had to prevent it from growing. So that was their land care. They provided those open landscapes that they needed and benefited from. They used fire, and actually there was fire, natural fire too, from lightning that helped them. And there was a synergy between them maintaining open landscapes and then supporting the huge herds of herbivores like the bison. And I wore my bison t-shirt tonight, by the way, just so you can see that. Wore my bison t-shirt and elk, and that provided for them pretty much everything they needed. And the bison and the elk also maintained the open landscapes. There were a couple of keystone species, we'll talk a little bit more about that later, that have a bigger effect on a landscape than most species do. Okay. So bison, now I have no evidence that there were bison in Ontario, except that the current American bison as we know it in Ontario. There is a record in Toronto of somebody digging up the skull of a bison in the 1920s, but it had straight horns. It didn't have the regular bison, and the skull was a little bit different. So there was some form of bison in this area in southern Ontario 10,000 years ago that was carbon dated to 10,000 years old. But on the other side of the Detroit and St. Clair rivers in Michigan and in Ohio and Indiana, there were bison. Not a lot, I don't think, but there were bison, because bison prefer mixed grass prairies more than tall grass prairies. Mixed grass prairies have higher protein levels than tall grass prairies, apparently. And a big beast like bison needs a lot of protein. So I'm really keen on bison, and I've actually taken trips to Saskatchewan and Montana to see herds of wild bison. There's about 600,000 bison in North America now, but 350 to 400,000 of them are on farms like cattle, and they're going to be going to the slaughterhouse. So the native land care truly influenced how our forests would develop. They were controlling how they would develop. And so they created a much more biodiverse, much more variety in landscape by doing that. And that resulted in a much more biodiverse list of species of everything, plants, animals. So it was a benefit to Mother Nature for them to do that. And they did that for thousands of years, right? Thousands of years. So we've gone from snow and ice to deciduous forest and open landscapes. And then the Spaniards arrived. And we know who arrived in 1492 in the Caribbean and in Mexico. And then shortly after that, more Spaniards to Florida and the Gulf Coast. And they brought with them diseases that no human being in North America had ever been exposed to before. Okay. Smallpox, measles, mumps, things like that. And that obviously, as you know, had a devastating effect on the population of the First Nations or Native Americans, however you want to say them, indigenous people, whatever name you want to use. It's a struggle for me to find the right name because everybody's got a different opinion of what you should be saying. Okay, so and because of commerce and trade, now here's the thing you have to really understand, and you probably wouldn't even guess this, is how many people, how many humans were in North America in 1492? You know, and the answer is, according to genocide.org, about 30 million. 30 million. There's also estimates of 50 and 60 million. Okay. So I think 30 million is one of the lower estimates I've seen. That is the same population at that time as Europe, 30 million. And yet the Europeans came over here and said, hey, nobody's home. Let's put up a flag. It's ours. Let's take, you know, like there were 30 million people here. And so because of their trade and commerce, the disease showed up in the south, but it traveled north and east and west from the south without any Europeans going there. Okay, it started spreading on its own because they were mingling with each other, trading with each other, you know, that kind of thing, traveling. They weren't too many nomadic tribes pre-European contact. They were pretty much in territories, that sort of thing. So So yeah, the disease traveled across North America to the point that by the time, Champlain and Cadillac and LaSalle showed up here, 90% of the population had passed away. They found a depleted population of human beings. There probably was nobody here in a lot of the regions at that time. So can you imagine losing 90% of your 30 million people and then the effect that had on your land care of the landscape? All of a sudden it was done. It was gone. There was no land care. And so without the land care, the great rewilding developed. Nobody was there to stop the forests from spreading and taking over the open landscapes, the tallgrass prairie meadows, things like that. So over centuries, starting around 1600, 1650, there was an increase in forest and old growth cover. Okay. Now there's another little interesting link to this is that maybe you've heard of the mini ice age. Well, the mini ice age was like from 1500 to 1800, something like that, 1700. That coincides totally with the European expansion around the globe and the elimination of indigenous peoples globally, and then the rewilding of the landscapes without their land care. And so many trees and forests grew that it sucked so much carbon out of the atmosphere that the planet chilled a little bit. That's a theory. That's a theory, okay, that's why that happened. And then after the great rewilding and the forest became thick and dense with now 6 and 7 and 8 foot diameter trees, pioneers showed up about the early 1800s in this area. I don't know, 1810, 20, 30s, something like that. I mean, those explorers were here in 16 and 1700, but actual settlement didn't happen in southern Ontario until the early 1800s. And by then there was the deep, dark forest. And of course, they assumed it always was the deep, dark forest, right? I mean, why would they think any differently? And so, but there was still some tallgrass prairie at that time. And they quickly turned to the tallgrass prairie because that was the easy place. That was the easy place to make a living. You had an open landscape, you had great herds of animals, and it was easy. These are two bison. That is a pile of bison skulls at Detroit. I forget what they used them for. They used them for something. And so they took that bounty. They took the bison, they took the elk, and they took the passenger pigeon as an example too. And there were billions and billions of passenger pigeons. And some of them, one of the last stands for them was in Michigan, actually. And there was a great effort in the 1800s to try and save the passenger pigeon in central Michigan, but of course that failed. It's one of those gregarious species that needed to be in the big numbers, the billions, for their ecology to function properly. And when they were reduced to small numbers, it just wasn't working for them anymore. And anyways, there was a period of time where it's been written in a number of books that no man, woman, child, or magistrate or anybody could resist the fun of shooting pigeons out of the sky. Just shooting the sky. See how many you could shoot. And they did it day after day, And so it really stuns me to think that First Nations people lived for thousands of years with millions of bison and billions of passenger pigeons. And Europeans show up, and in a few decades, in the numbers of just thousands, wiped out the passenger pigeon and nearly wiped out the American bison. Like, that just stuns me, that the difference in a culture and a mindset, that somebody lived in harmony with that and benefited that. And there were 30 million people in North America. It wasn't like there was only a few of them. You know what I mean? So, and then a few Europeans show up but in the Midwest, there weren't very many compared to the East Coast. So it just really stuns me that sort of thing happened. And then, of course, they took those tallgrass prairies. These are actually not pictures of tallgrass prairies, but because all you had to do to farm in a prairie habitat was drop a match and get out a plow, whether you had an oxen or a horse or a tractor, and you were in business. You were farming. You didn't want to go to the deep, dark woods of the 6 foot diameter trees, right? But after they took all the tallgrass prairie, then they did turn to the deep, dark woods, and they started taking that too. And they took a lot of it. Like I think Here in Middlesex, you have about a 13% forest cover. Lambton's 9%, Chatham-Kent's 3.5%. I gave a presentation in Kingsville yesterday, and I said they were 5%, and no, we're only 3%. And I'm like, well, okay. So it's very, very low. So yeah, we did a lot of that clearing, and we did a lot of that very early on too. And so the taking of the local forests was a big business, okay? And it was a big job, but it was also big business. And then that started the opportunity to start farming in areas that had forest cover too. So there's a ship in the St. Clair River, there's a sawmill. There were sawmills all along the rivers, there were sawmills along the lakes. It was a big, big business. And here's a couple of pictures of London and Sarnia, circa 1900, okay? I think the pictures are actually late 1800s. Do you see any trees? There's some little ones, not very many. I mean, those were clear-cut areas. We are probably standing right now, well, we are standing right now in a clear-cut forest area. You know, if we were here 400 years ago, there'd probably be too many trees in this room for us to sit and have this meeting. You know, we're always in a landscape that's been impacted so much, and we don't ever consider it in our daily lives, right? We don't consider that this is a clear cut, but those bad guys in Brazil, they better stop doing that, right? But we live in clear cuts. That's a picture from Front Street, looking kind of northeast in Sarnia. The river's behind. I don't know how this picture was taken in the 1800s because it's taken from a high angle. And I could go to that same spot today. I'd have to use a drone to get that angle. I don't know how they got that angle. And take that picture, and you'd hardly see a building. It would look like a forest. You know, so we can make a difference. We can make an impact by planting trees, right? Those, in fact, right in that picture on Christina Street, right about in the middle of it, there's one, but there were 3 very large tulip trees. Well, they weren't there in the late 1800s, 1900s. They weren't there. They're not in this picture, unless there are a couple of those little things down there. I don't know, but I always assumed those trees had always been there when Sarnia got developed and grew, but this picture proves that they were not there at that time. And there's London. There's nothing showing behind London there. So when I go to museums and historical places and I look at the pictures, I'm not looking at the buildings. I'm not looking at the architecture, you know, I'm looking at what's behind the buildings, what's in the background, what's the landscape. And I'm always just like blown away by there's nothing behind the buildings, basically. Yeah, it's because it was quite clear cut. Yeah. So I'm going to use this as an example. Okay. The first report of the directors of the State Forestry Commission of Michigan. Okay. So that's just the other side of the Detroit River and St. Clair River. So I consider that the same thing was happening here, was happening in Michigan on the other side. Get rid of the names Ontario, Michigan. It's the same region. Okay. So they developed a forestry commission. And the act was formed in 1887. I'm going to read this part to you. Okay. It's a few pages. I'm going to read this part to you. It shall be the duty of said forestry commission to institute an inquiry into the extent to which the forests of Michigan are being destroyed. So there was some concern already in 1887 about the loss of forest cover, the loss of trees. Also, as to the effect of this diminution, of wooded surface in disturbing and deteriorating the natural conditions of the climate. So 150 years ago, they were saying, what's this going to do to our climate? How is this going to impact our weather? Okay. So they want to know what the extent of the loss of forests were going to do and how that was going to affect the natural conditions of the climate. So we were talking about this 150 years ago, and we're still talking about it today. Okay, I believe that's the Detroit River there. So the Forestry Commission of Michigan, the said commission shall make a report of the results of their inquiries to the governor of the state, together with legislation as seems to them expedient to propose to preserve and restore the forest wealth of the state. So that's what the job they were given to do. They were supposed to come back with a report to create some legislation to preserve, restore the wealth of the forest wealth of the state. That was their task. Okay. This is what they said in their report. The commission takes the liberty of stating that they are not opposed to the removal of timber. They do not recommend that farmers should go about planting trees, forests on good arable land. They do not believe that peril is imminent to Michigan as a result of the extensive loss of the forests. On contrary, they commend the practice of securing the best possible returns by cutting off the mature timber of our state and have no sentiment to waste over the removal of the monarchs of the forest that are ready for harvest. So like, no problem. Just keep taking. Does that kind of like ring a bell? That's still happening in Chatham-Kent, still happening in Essex. We don't have tree cutting bylaws in those counties. We've lost thousands of acres in the last few years in Chatham-Kent, and you can't stop it. This makes it a little more interesting too. The people of the state of Michigan enact that the members of the State Board of Agriculture are hereby constituted a commission to be known as the Independent Forestry Commission. So they asked the ag guys, should we stop cutting down trees? And then they told them the Independent Forestry Commission shall serve without compensation. So we want you to do this job. We want you to go and look, find out when we're concerned about what's happening to the forest and we're losing them, what should we do? Give us legislation. And they asked the agriculture people to do that, and they didn't pay them to do that. And they didn't do that. They could care less. And then on the other side of the picture are lobbyists, right? We're still dealing with lobbyists. And that was mostly the timber industry. And of course, they throw the same things at you. It's big business, lots of numbers, good tax dollars, lots of jobs. And so there was a no-win situation for that forestry commission to come back with anything to protect the forest covers of Michigan. And the same thing was happening in Ontario. Yeah. And by 1880, we were pretty close to where we are now by the late 1800s in southern Ontario, and the same thing in Michigan. Those are some of the southern counties in Michigan, somewhere between 25 and 17, 15% forest cover by 1880. Those are images of Port Huron 100 years ago and what it looks like today. The left side of that newer picture is starting the downtown Port Huron. So, yeah. And habitat loss. Forest cover in the empty county is around 9 or 10%. Okay, so that's a typical image from an airplane. I took that picture. That's a Google Earth shot in the middle of Chatham-Kent. Little patches of forest. Small blocks of forest. Little islands of green. And if you're something that needs forest cover, that's not going to cut it. Okay, so our list of species at risk, our endangered species list is growing every year, all the time. And basically, it's just a slow decline of everything in our region that needs that forest cover. And also tallgrass prairie. Because as we said, we've lost 99.73% of the tallgrass prairie in North America. So if you're a tallgrass prairie creature, you're doomed, you're done. I mean, you can't live on 0.03% of what you had before. I mean, that's just not even thinkable. It takes a while for that to play out. You know, life really works hard at surviving and existing, and so that there's a delay between the loss of the forest cover and the loss of the prairie or whatever kind of habitat and the loss of the animal. Some of it's fairly quick. And people say, well, you know, when you lose a wetland or you lose a forest, they can go to the next wetland or the next forest. No, you can't go to the next. Those animals can't go to the next. First of all, it'd be hard for them to get there. Another thing is that it already has its carrying capacity. It's already full of those animals, those birds, those insects, those plants and trees. Like there's no room. So basically, when you eliminate something now, at this point of having lost 90% on average of our natural cover, when you lose something, everything that lived there, you just killed it. It's got enough place to go, nothing to do. So that's the situation, forest cover and habitat loss in Lambton County. And then the little blocks of forest that we do have drainage ditches alongside of them. The fields are tiled, and so they've totally changed the hydrology of those landscapes. And so those forests are much drier today than they were 300 years ago. Okay. These trees that are growing in there, because tiling really started up in the last 50 to 100 years, and to any kind of extent, those trees growing in there, I don't think they can hardly replace themselves in that different moisture hydrology regime than when they germinated 100 or 150 years ago, or even 75 years ago. You know what I mean? So those forests don't have much of a chance in the long term. And when I see a picture like that one where that open field has that winding water path through it, what I see is, because you can still find some of these, like in Bickford Oak Woods near Sarnia, interior forest, buttonbush, swamp, you know, and they're very primordial, primeval kind of habitats. That's what that would have been. Now that's been plowed and disked for over 100 years, and and then sprayed and poisoned for the last 60 or 70 years, right, since the Second World War. So, but that's what I see there. There would have been wood ducks and great blue and heron rookeries and beavers and all kinds of amphibians living in that kind of habitat. And all a farmer, and I'm a farmer, all a farmer would see is poor drainage, right? Habitat loss now enters the alien invaders. Okay, so this is all part of our history. It's a little more closer than the Ice Age kind of thing, but this is all part of our history because this goes back over 100 years too. Enter the alien invaders. You see that little alien guy there? You know who he is? Everybody know who he is? That's the emerald ash borer. Okay. What year was it? Windsor, Detroit. It radiated out from Detroit. Was it 2001, 2002, summers around there? Millions of ash trees have been lost to the emerald ash borer. And there's a picture of that tree on my right. Is that on your right too? Okay. And that's usually what you see happen. The tree dies, but the roots and the stump keep trying to that fight to exist, right? Sending up new shoots. Oh, we're gonna recover, and then the borer just kills the whole thing. And we've lost a great portion of our forest cover, even though the forest cover was still there. But there are woods in our region that were at least 50% ash, most of them are like 20, 25, but it was a very common tree. And it was probably a common tree because it replaced any gaps that the elms had when we lost them. And if you're on sandy or lighter soil, the American chestnuts, when we lost them. Okay. So those are great losses. This is an image of Mandamin Woods that Lambton Wildlife owns near Sarnia. Those are all ash trees laying on the ground. It's a very interesting thing, okay? So this picture on the left is an oak and a dead ash tree. Picture on the right, I don't know if you can see it on the TV screen, half of that woods is gray with dead trees, and that was ash. That image, half of that image is gray from dead trees. I took that picture, I hired a plane and I flew around and took pictures of these things. If you flew over that bush today, it's all green. The dead trees have fallen. They're laying on the ground. The finer, smaller branches have rotted away. Vegetation has covered that and filled in that gap, but it's not trees. Some trees, it's a lot of more sun-loving things because there's an opening gap. And all of a sudden, even Phragmites is starting to show up in the middle of these woods, and the different raspberries and elderberries and things. That's what fills in those gaps. And I've seen pictures taken over like 40 years of when a tornado wiped out a block of woods in the States, and they took a picture every 10 years for 40 years. And it took, and the guy just happened to have a picture, and that's why he did this before the tornado. So here was the example of the forest, the clearing, and what came back. And it's not the same thing that you lost with the tornado or with the emerald ash borer. So that's very interesting. So when we lose something, it's very, very hard to get it back. This is all very concerning, right? I mean, just consider all of these diseases and pests. Chestnut blight, Dutch elm disease, emerald ash borer, flowering dogwood blight, Japanese longhorn beetle, butternut canker, thousand cankers disease, oak wilts, hemlock woolly adelgid, beech bark blight, and now there's beech leaf blight. And I got to add another one to the list. I just learned about a couple of weeks ago, called the elm zigzag sawfly. Another introduction from beyond that is defoliating what small young elms develop in our landscape. In Eastern Ontario, it is rampant everywhere, totally defoliating trees. So the last of the elms that are struggling and growing to a size to produce some seed are now getting hit by another pest, the zigzag sawfly. And it's been found all the way to London, so it's coming. It's on its way here too. The only one of these diseases and problems that we don't have here yet is the thousand cankers disease. And that attacks black walnuts. And in the States, it's $1 billion industry. And they've been fighting it. And it's now in Ohio and Pennsylvania, and it's moving north. So this is really very concerning bad news for our forests and for our tree species, all of this. And this is part of our history, right? We introduced these things: globalization, progress, growth, wealth. Yeah. And along with those losses came the extirpations and extinctions of things. When's the last time you saw a lynx in South Middlesex? Right? Well, you can't see a passenger pigeon because they're extinct. The last one lived in the Toledo Zoo. Her name was Martha. Did you ever hear about Martha? People used to go and look at Martha. There were billions of them, you know, and that's kind of the bigger, you know, macro species that we think about. Everything's in decline. You know, when I first started doing Christmas bird counts, Walsburg, Walpole Island, we were the redheaded capital of Ontario. We would get 10, 12 redheaded woodpeckers. They're kind of a semi-migrant. There's resident birds. There's birds that go like to North Bay, and they'll migrate south. But we haven't had a redheaded woodpecker on a Christmas bird count in Walsburg for like 12 or 15 years. Like they're just disappearing. Flying squirrels, southern flying squirrels are a species at risk. Cerulean warblers, scarlet tanagers, all these things are in decline. Cerulean warbler is a threatened species. So when you lose habitat, you start to lose all the species that go with it. As I was talking about, whether it's tallgrass prairie or whether it's forest cover, it's not good news for the animals, right? But of course, they're just, you know, collateral damage for our growth and our progress, right? So that kind of brings me down to talking a little bit about the Carolinian forest zone. And I find this like really special. You know, I'm born in the Great Lakes. I'm a Great Lakes boy. And, you know, if you go from 42 degrees latitude, you know, at east or west, they don't even have a third of the tree species we have. And, you know, we have a lot of really cool tree species. This is the Carolinian zone in Ontario. If you're a gardener, it's basically the zone 6 hardiness zone. That's kind of what it follows. And we have unique species in that Carolinian zone. Lots of different birds, lots of different tree species, lots of different wildflowers, things like that in the Carolinian forest. Okay. A very special place. And we're at the northern fringe of that zone. We only have to get, I'm going to go back here. See, Guelph isn't in it. Okay, they're not in the Carolinian. They're just a little bit outside of it. Not that there's a black line written on the ground anywhere, drawn on the ground anywhere, but because it's, you know, it's obviously varying. But and maybe these species will continue to migrate, with the exception of it's kind of hard to do that today when 90% of the landscape is highways, cities, and farmland. How do plants and animals move around now? It really, really restricts their ability to do that. So it's hard for them. So maybe we have to help out a little bit. And that's a whole different topic though. The same thing can be said in Michigan. Okay. See that green area painted? That's kind of like the zone 6. That would be their Carolinian forest. I'm actually giving this talk tomorrow night in Columbus, Michigan. And they're going to have a hoot when I say you live in the Carolinian forest. They don't know what we're talking about here in Ontario. They're like, you guys are crazy. Carolinian forest. 1,000 kilometers, that's 1,000 miles south of here, you know, kind of thing. So some of our Carolinian species include my favorite tree, the American sycamore. Some of them can be so white, very, very white. Some people say, oh, maybe it's a birch, but you've never seen a birch the size of these things and the shape or anything like that. So they're very, very special, unique species. When I was a little boy going to school in Sarnia, there was one in the corner of the schoolyard. I just had my picture taken with it again recently, and she's about 40 inches in diameter now. That was 63 years ago. Okay. So that tree's got to be over 100. I mean, because it was a big tree when I was in grade 1, right? So that tree's got to be over 100 years old. And so I've been looking at sycamores my whole life. I think I was the only kid in the school that was looking at that tree. And I guarantee I'm the only kid in that school talking about it in 2023. Yeah. There's the sycamore, Platanus occidentalis. One of our largest growing trees. Tulip tree, another one of our largest, probably our tallest growing deciduous tree, the tulip tree, having flowers that look like tulip, right? Yellow and orange. Here's some old growth tulip trees in Joyce Kilmer Memorial Forest down in North Carolina. I've been there 3 times. I don't know if I'll get back, but boy, what a treat to see those big 350-year-old tulip trees. Just amazing. Sassafras, there's another Carolinian species. I really prefer sand. You can try to grow it in clay. I have for years, and none of them have survived. But you never know. Maybe somebody can make it work somewhere. And don't just think you're going to dig a hole and add some sand, because those roots got to go a lot further than the hole you just dug to get it going, kind of thing. But anyways, and they have a nice fruit that birds like to eat and spread the seeds around. Right? Honey locust, that's another Carolinian species. They have big thorns. The true wild honey locusts have big thorns on them and big bean pods, that sort of thing. Very delicate foliage on them. Ohio buckeye. Now that's the only place that's found in Ontario in the wild is on Walpole Island. Okay. So it is on our Ontario list, but you get off Walpole Island. Although I've heard that in the Nith River area, there's an escaped population. So it's hardy in our zone, in the Carolinian zone. You can plant it anywhere, and that is garden centers sell them. So there is an escaped population introduced along the Nith River. Pawpaws. First Nations probably brought those to us. Turns out there's a fellow right now, Andrew Bodrug, doing a study on pawpaw populations in Ontario. And so I think Chatham-Kent is at the lead now with 37 or 38 known sites. He's actually found more sites than was historically believed to exist before we lost the forest cover. So that's kind of interesting that he's found that many. And Chatham-Kent's the capital of pawpaws. Okay, then we're the capital. Essex is second, but we beat them out. There's a lot in Middlesex and in Lambton County too, and in Elgin and in the Niagara region. Cool tree. I love the fruit. Actually, one of the people I met today on the way here, I had to drop off a box of pawpaws because they were going to a meeting and they wanted people to try pawpaws. So you don't get to try pawpaws. I gave them away. Kentucky coffee trees, another one, Carolinian species. They have big bean pods too. Big double compound leaves, like to a meter long, even longer, with over 100 leaflets on them. Really, really tropical looking trees. Hop tree. This is a small tree. This is a great backyard patio by your sidewalk tree, and it supports giant swallowtail caterpillars. Black gum. We have that in Walpole Island and Tanager Woods near West Elgin. We have black gums. There's a number of oaks that are strictly Carolinian species, like pin oak and Shumard oak. And you can tell a Shumard oak. See the picture on the right? Now, apparently my flash went off. I was in the deep, dark woods, apparently. My flash went off. But that tree in between those two, further back, that looks black, look at the buttressing on it. Okay, and look at these oaks in front of it and the oak further behind it, almost straight into the ground. Okay, there's a little bit of a flare. That's diagnostic. You see that Shumard oak. Okay, see the one on the left? See the buttressing on the roots? I don't need to see anything else. I see that from a distance. I could call that tree from 100 meters away. Oh, there's a Shumard over there. To look at the leaves and look at the acorns is pretty hard between that and a red. But when you see that buttressing, that's the real clue. Blue ash with its square stems, quadrangulata. It has square stems. It's the only ash that the Emerald Ash Board didn't like the taste of. Yeah. So on Pelee Island, and the archipelago of the Western Lake Erie, there are ash trees. All of the white and green ash are pretty much gone, and all the blue ash are still there. You can walk through a forest cover on Pelee Island that is blue ash, hackberry, chinkapin oak. That's the matrix. It's the only place I think you can do that in the world, those islands in Lake Erie. A forest of blue ash, chinkapin, and hackberry. Hackberry is a very newcomer to Ontario. Wasn't here like 120 years ago in mainland Ontario. It was probably on the islands at that time. Okay, so before I get on to what to do, I just want to say, you know, like these Carolian species are special. They're at the northern fringe of their range, so they're genetically unique, okay? And I believe they need protection. And there's been some consideration lately by the organizations that decide what's threatened and what's endangered, that if there's a healthy population in Kentucky, we don't got to worry about it. That's the way they're thinking now. And I'm like, no, because that tree in Kentucky probably wouldn't survive here, right? Because of the different climate, the different whatever, the different soils, it probably wouldn't survive here. Or the tree in like red oak grows in Algonquin Park, and it grows in southern Georgia. We'll try and take an acorn from Georgia and grow it in Algonquin Park, and try and take it from Algonquin Park and try and grow it in Georgia. It's not going to work. So the genetics of these species at the fringe of their range are special. They can handle stuff. They will speciate. They will actually create new species. They will mutate. They will handle what's coming to them. And to say, well, there's a population in Kentucky, we don't got to worry about it, is a big mistake, in my opinion. We really need to protect these trees here in Ontario. Okay. And the other nice thing I mentioned before, that if you go east or west, there's like way less species, like 20 and 20. And if you go to Alberta and you start talking about pawpaws and sassafras and black gum, you know, tulip trees, they're like, this guy's making up names. Like, that can't be real. But those are common trees here in southern Ontario. Really common trees. So I think that's just really special that at our latitude, and that's because of the Great Lakes moderating our climate, right? Because of the Great Lakes. So what do we do? Well, when we do habitat restoration, we better be planting native trees. Here's a few quotes. E.O. Wilson, we should nurture and grow native species one by one for the deep history they hold with the land. The deep history they hold with the land. Okay? Plant a sugar maple. Plant a silver maple, not a Norway maple. The #1 sold tree at garden centers in Ontario, Norway maple. Whether it's a red one or a green one, they're Acer platanoides. It's a Norway maple. Yeah. So got to think native. Don't buy cultivars. See those trees on the left? Those are autumn blaze maples. It's a Freeman's maple. It's a cultivar. It's a clone. Every one of those trees didn't have to be pruned to look like that. They didn't have to be painted to look like that. Every one of those trees is exactly the same tree genetically. And we planted millions and millions of them across North America. You think monoculture is bad? How about monoculture with monogenetics added to it, right? Yeah, very bad. Habitat and ecological restoration. Okay, so here's where I'm trying to bring some good news and some I don't like the word hope. You know, did you ever hear about hope was left in Pandora's box at the end kind of thing? You usually say, well, I hope something's going to turn out, means you're not going to do anything about it. You know, so I don't like the word hope, but give us something to look forward to, something to do, to try and make a difference. This is the point of restoration. Okay. So why do we engage in the restoration? It's all the things I talked about: the habitat loss, the alien species, the diseases, the climate change and global warming, which we've created a new aspect of recently. Endangered species, poor land management, pollution, poison. Pollution just means poison. You know, the water isn't polluted, it's poisoned. The air isn't polluted, it's poisoned. We got to understand that. Every river, every lake, all the water on planet Earth, except maybe what's coming out from underneath the glaciers in Greenland and Antarctica, is poisoned. Okay? Not polluted, it's poisoned. Ecological restoration can mean anything from passive, just let the forest come back in and do its job on its own, to let's go collect some acorns, turn around and plant them in the field that we're restoring, to creating pit and mound topography that you would find in an old growth forest. I like that. A lot of biologists, ecologists don't. I really like it because I feel it holds moisture on the landscape. Okay. If you have a flat field and you get an inch of rain, the whole field's the same wetness. And 3 days later, the whole field's the same dryness. You put those pits and mounds in it, those pits will hold water for weeks. I've seen those pits hold water all summer into the fall. Amphibians have successfully laid eggs and reproduced in some of those pits. And this is at Sydenham River Nature Reserve near Alvinston. Very successful for amphibians. Animals go to it for drinks right away. deer, turkeys. Sit there in the evening, you can watch them come out for a drink to those pits and mounds. And it gives an opportunity for biodiversity, okay? Because you got water in the pit, you got a drier mound, and you got the moisture level between this pit and mound and the next pit and mound. We put approximately 30 to 35 pits and mounds per acre, okay? And so that is the opportunity for more different kinds of species of plants to germinate. If the whole field's the same wetness and then the whole field's the same dryness, there's only a few species that are going to germinate on that compared to holding the moisture on the landscape. So that's just a little plug for what I believe is a good way to do restoration. It's a long-term vision. You know, I got to give conservation authorities kudos. Man, they can grow trees really fast in straight rows, really fast. They go in and they mow. They go in and they spray with Roundup. They go in and they spray with pre-emergent first. You know, a lot of poison used in that process, but they can grow trees really fast. But that will never become a forest. Even the pit and mound topography cannot become. We can't go back. Nature doesn't go backwards. Nature's always evolving forwards. So there's going to be a novel, something different, but we got to give it its best chance to do what it can do, right? So ecocentric restoration, the important thing about the ecocentric restoration to me, you just do these simple things: control alien species, use only native species, control animal populations because there's nothing to control them now, like white-tailed deer, use prescribed berms, things like that. Volunteering has become a big thing, and it's kind of bringing people together, linking ecology, sociology, and history, but kind of all put together, right? Thousands of people are getting involved in this. Today, there are over 1.5 million environmental non-government organizations in the world, over 1.5 million. 1950, there was a few. You know, that's not that long ago, right? And a lot of people trying to work to do a lot of good things and make a difference. And the lessons from history are we've been on the wrong path and we've been destroying things, right? And now we got to consider the common things, the monarch butterflies and endangered species. You know, do we care about eastern tiger swallowtails? Do we care about freshwater mussels? I do. You know, they belong here. They need to be here. They're part of the biodiversity. And that doesn't just mean the pretty things. It also includes snapping turtles and eastern fox snakes. We got to consider everything. You need the biodiversity. This is a quote from Sarah Stein. If anybody ever read Noah's Garden, Sarah Stein. Since each microbe, animal, and plant possesses some innate portion of the know-how that makes the whole earth work, the loss of any species erases some portion of the organic intelligence and leaves the land more stupid. Okay. Yeah. And that's the end of my presentation. So I talk to young people all the time. What you're doing today, if you're involved in ecological restoration, if you're involved in a conservation effort, if you're involved in an environmental effort, the things you do today will make a difference to what comes through this mess and evolution has to work with in the future. You can make a difference to what evolution has to work with in the future. Like, what a wonderful opportunity. Instead of saying it's hopeless and not trying to do anything, come on, there's a lot you can do. Okay.